Beaches are for relaxation, right? Warm sand, calm waves. But not tonight. What started as a simple beach party, turned into a nightmare, these friends will never forget. Strange sounds, shadows in the surf, and something watching, from the water. Stay with me, it gets darker. Everyone loves a good beach party. A bonfire crackling, friends laughing, the moon shining bright. But what if the ocean hides more than just fish? Tonight's story takes us to a secluded beach, where four friends find themselves trapped by an unseen horror. Let's dive in, shall we? It was supposed to be a celebration. Jack, Emily, Sarah, and Nate planned to meet on Moonlit Cove, a stretch of sand, far from the city. They wanted peace, privacy, and a night under the stars. But from the moment they arrived, something felt off. The ocean was unusually still, eerily silent. The drive to Moonlit Cove had been uneventful, just winding roads, and the occasional glimpse of the ocean through the trees. But as the group parked and stepped onto the sand, a strange feeling settled over them. The beach was empty, as expected, yet it felt wrong, almost too quiet. Jack, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, shrugged it off. "It's perfect," he said, tossing his backpack onto the ground. "No crowds, no noise, just us." Emily, ever the optimist, smiled and began unpacking snacks and blankets. Nate lit the fire, while Sarah stared at the water, uneasy. The waves lapped against the shore, in a rhythmic pattern, but something about it felt unnatural. "The tide's weird," Sarah muttered, her arms crossed. Emily glanced up from her bag, raising a brow. "Weird how?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her friend's tone unsettled her. "It's too calm," Sarah replied, her voice low. "Like it's holding its breath." Nate laughed, tossing a piece of driftwood into the flames. "It's a beach, Sarah. You're overthinking. Relax for once." She frowned but didn't argue, instead shifting her gaze to the horizon. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery hues, the group settled in. Laughter filled the air, as Jack told exaggerated stories of his latest adventures, and Emily shared embarrassing childhood memories. For a while, it felt like any other night, but the calm didn't last. It started with a sound, faint but distinct, a low hum, that seemed to come from the water. Sarah stiffened, her eyes snapping toward the ocean. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others paused, exchanging uncertain glances. "Hear what?" Jack asked, squinting at the shoreline. The hum grew louder, resonating deep in their chests. It was almost hypnotic, like a song without words. Emily stood, brushing sand off her jeans. "Maybe it's a boat," she offered, though her voice wavered. "No," Sarah said firmly, stepping closer to the water. "It's coming from beneath the waves." Nate rolled his eyes, grabbing a stick and poking the fire. "Great. Now we're in a horror movie," he joked, though even he couldn't shake the growing unease creeping over them. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The group exchanged nervous looks, the cheerful energy from earlier now gone. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah suggested, her tone urgent. But Jack scoffed, waving her off. "Come on, it's just a weird sound." Emily hesitated, torn between staying and leaving. "We came all this way," she said, trying to sound confident. "Let's at least finish the snacks. It's probably nothing." Sarah frowned, but didn't push further. The fire crackled, filling the silence, as tension settled over them. Minutes passed, and the conversation became forced. Every so often, someone would glance toward the water, as if expecting something to emerge. When nothing happened, they began to relax again, convincing themselves it was all in their heads. Then, the shadows appeared. At first, it was subtle, dark shapes moving, just beyond the surf, barely visible under the moonlight. Sarah noticed them first, her breath hitching. "Look," she whispered, pointing. The others followed her gaze, their laughter dying, as they saw the figures. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The shapes were humanoid, but wrong, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't come onto the shore, instead hovering at the edge of the water, watching. "It's probably seaweed," Jack said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Seaweed doesn't move like that," Sarah shot back, her fear turning to anger. "We need to go, now." Nate stood, brushing off his jeans. "Okay, fine, we'll go," he said, his usual confidence replaced by unease. But as they packed up their things, the figures moved closer. The shapes glided through the water, with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them and the shore in seconds. The group froze, staring as the figures emerged from the waves. Their skin glistened like wet stone, and their eyes were hollow voids. Emily screamed, dropping the bag of snacks. The creatures tilted their heads, in unison, as if studying her. "Run!" Jack shouted, grabbing Emily's arm, and pulling her toward the car. Nate and Sarah didn't need to be told twice, sprinting across the sand, as the creatures advanced. The sand slowed their steps, every movement feeling like a struggle. Behind them, the creatures moved effortlessly, their bodies gliding over the ground, as though gravity didn't apply to them. Emily stumbled, her scream cutting through the night, as one of the creatures lunged. Jack turned, yanking her to her feet, just in time. "Keep going!" he yelled, his voice raw with fear. The car was in sight, but it felt miles away. Nate reached it first, fumbling with the keys, as his hands shook. "Hurry!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. The creatures were nearly upon them, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Nate finally unlocked the doors, and the group piled in, slamming them shut. "Go! Go! Go!" Jack shouted. The engine roared to life, and the car tore down the dirt road, leaving the beach behind. For a moment, silence filled the car, save for their ragged breathing. "What the hell were those things?" Emily whispered, clutching Jack's arm. No one answered. The only sound was the pounding of their hearts, and the distant hum, faint but still there, lingering in their ears. They didn't stop until they reached the main road, the glow of streetlights a welcome sight. But even as they drove farther from the beach, the fear didn't fade. Sarah stared out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "They'll follow us," she murmured. "I know they will." The car sped through the night, headlights cutting through the darkness, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never left them. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see those hollow-eyed creatures sprinting after them. "We have to call someone," she said, her voice shaky. "Call who?" Jack shot back, gripping the wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white. "What are we gonna say? That some things came out of the ocean and tried to kill us?" The panic in his voice was barely masked by his sarcasm. They weren't human, Sarah whispered, still staring out the window. They didn't move like us, they didn't look like us. There's something else. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Nate broke the silence, his voice trembling. Maybe it was some kind of prank? Like, people in costumes, trying to scare tourists? He didn't sound like he believed it, and no one else did either. They weren't costumes, Emily said firmly, shaking her head. I could feel it, when it looked at me. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything good. Jack's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Okay, fine, but what the hell do we do now? We can't just go home like nothing happened. We need to leave, Sarah said suddenly, her tone resolute. Get as far away from this place as we can. Those things. They're not tied to the beach. They'll follow us. Emily turned to her, horrified. Follow us? What do you mean? How do you know that? I don't know, Sarah admitted, her voice cracking. But I feel it. Like they marked us, or something. Her words sent a shiver through the car. Jack pulled over abruptly, the tires skidding on the gravel. Okay, everyone stop, he snapped, turning in his seat, to face the group. We're not getting anywhere, just freaking out like this. Let's think. Did anyone see where they came from? Or what they wanted? They didn't want anything, Sarah said, her voice hollow. They just wanted us gone. Or worse. The car was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Emily broke the stillness, her voice barely a whisper. We can't stay out here. We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere with people. Jack nodded reluctantly, and put the car back in gear, heading toward the nearest town. But as they drove, the sense of dread only grew stronger. The hum had followed them, faint but persistent, a sinister reminder of what they had left behind. When they reached the town, it was eerily quiet, the streets empty. Where is everyone? Nate asked, peering out the window. The houses were dark, and even the streetlights seemed dimmer than they should be. Jack parked the car outside a diner, with a flickering neon sign. Let's see if anyone's inside, he said, though his voice wavered. They climbed out of the car, sticking close together, as they approached the door. The diner was unlocked, but inside, it was just as empty as the streets. Plates of half-eaten food sat abandoned on tables, and a radio crackled faintly behind the counter, playing static. This isn't right, Emily whispered, clutching Jack's arm. Maybe they left in a hurry? Nate suggested weakly. An evacuation or something? Sarah shook her head. No, this isn't normal. It's like they disappeared. Jack grabbed a menu from the counter, flipping through it absently. All right, so what now? We hole up here and wait for help? No, Sarah said firmly. We keep moving. Whatever's happening, we can't stay in one place. Before anyone could argue, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the diner. The group froze, their eyes widening as the light outside dimmed. They're here, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jack bolted for the door, locking it, and shoving a chair under the handle. That won't stop them, Nate said, his voice rising in panic. It'll slow them down, Jack snapped. Now find something to defend yourself with. The group scattered, searching for anything they could use as a weapon. Emily grabbed a heavy coffee pot, while Sarah armed herself with a sharp knife from the kitchen. Nate found a crowbar, and Jack picked up a fire extinguisher. The hum intensified, shaking the windows. Then, the shadows appeared again, gliding through the streets, their hollow eyes fixed on the diner. One of them stepped forward, its movements unnervingly smooth. "What do you want?" Jack yelled, his voice cracking. The creature tilted its head, as if considering his question. Then it spoke, its voice, a chilling blend of whispers and echoes. "You don't belong here." The words sent a chill through the group, freezing them in place. Jack tightened his grip on the fire extinguisher, his knuckles white. "What do you mean? What are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking, despite his effort to sound brave. The creature didn't respond right away. Instead, it stepped closer, its hollow eyes piercing through the glass. The shadows behind it shifted, twisting unnaturally, as if they had lives of their own. "This place is ours," it finally said, its voice a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "Yours?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean? The beach? The town?" "All of it," the creature hissed. "You disturbed the balance. Now, you must pay." "What balance?" Nate blurted out, his panic rising. "We didn't do anything. We were just on the beach, having a fire, hanging out." The creature's head tilted again, almost in amusement. "You opened the way," it said, each word deliberate, echoing with malice. "And now, it cannot be closed." The glass of the diner's windows suddenly cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading, with a deafening sound. The group scrambled backward, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly. "They're coming in!" Sarah cried, her voice trembling. Jack raised the fire extinguisher, his eyes darting between the others. "All right, listen up. We stick together, no matter what. Don't let them separate us." The windows shattered, and the creatures poured in, their movements unnervingly fluid and silent. They seemed to glide, rather than walk, their forms flickering, like bad reception on an old TV. Jack was the first to act, spraying the fire extinguisher at one of the creatures. The thick, white foam slowed it down, making it recoil, with an unnatural hiss. "It works!" he shouted. "Use anything you can." Emily swung the coffee pot at another, the heavy ceramic shattering against its form. The creature stumbled, but didn't fall. Instead, it turned its hollow gaze on her, its elongated fingers reaching out. "Get back!" Sarah yelled, plunging her knife into the creature's arm. It let out an inhuman shriek, a sound so piercing, it made them all clap their hands over their ears. The creature recoiled, its form flickering, like static before dissolving into the air. "They can be hurt!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with both fear and determination. The group fought desperately, using anything they could find to fend off the creatures. Nate swung his crowbar wildly, connecting with one of their heads. It shattered like glass, the shards dissolving into nothingness before they hit the ground. But for every creature they defeated, more appeared, their numbers seemingly endless. The diner felt smaller, with each passing second, the walls closing in, as the shadows surrounded them. "We can't keep this up!" Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face. "There's too many of them." Jack's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. His gaze landed on the back door, partially obscured by boxes. The kitchen. Go. Now. He yelled, shoving Nate toward the door. The group barreled through the kitchen, knocking over pots and pans, in their haste. Sarah grabbed a container of salt from the counter, throwing it behind them, as they ran. To their shock, the creatures recoiled from it, hissing angrily. "They don't like salt," Sarah exclaimed, her voice filled with a mix of terror and triumph. "Good to know," Jack muttered, grabbing another container and throwing it at the advancing creatures. They burst out the back door, into the alley, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. The hum was louder now, vibrating through their bodies. The shadows seemed to spill into the alley, creeping along the walls, like living ink. "Where do we go?" Emily cried, looking frantically in all directions. Jack pointed toward a nearby church, its steeple just visible in the moonlight. "There. If they hate salt, maybe holy ground will slow them down too." Without questioning him, the group sprinted toward the church, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The creatures followed, their movements becoming more erratic, as if the pursuit was taking a toll on them too. They reached the church doors, throwing them open, and stumbling inside. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, and Jack shoved a pew against them, for good measure. The silence inside the church was almost deafening, broken only by their labored breathing. Emily collapsed onto a pew, clutching her chest. "Are we safe?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Sarah said, though her eyes remained fixed on the door. The hum outside had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on them. "What did they mean?" Emily asked suddenly, looking at Sarah. "About us opening the way?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice shaking. But I think it has to do with the fire. Something about it. Maybe it was a signal, or a ritual we didn't know we were performing." Nate shook his head, in disbelief. "That's insane. We just wanted to roast marshmallows, not summon. Whatever they are." "Doesn't matter," Jack said firmly, standing up. "What matters is how we stop this. If we open the way, there has to be a way to close it." His words hung in the air, a glimmer of hope in their despair. But as the group began to gather their thoughts, a faint sound echoed through the church, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on stone. They weren't alone. The footsteps echoed louder, reverberating off the church's high ceilings. Each step was deliberate, slow, and filled with an ominous weight that made the group's breaths hitch. Jack raised the fire extinguisher again, his knuckles whitening, as he motioned for everyone to stay behind him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice breaking the silence like a gunshot. No answer came, only the steady approach of footsteps. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the stone walls and sending shivers down their spines. Sarah gripped her knife tightly, her hands trembling. "It could be one of them. Or it could be something worse," she whispered. "Something worse?" Nate hissed, his panic spiking. "What's worse than those shadow things?" The tapping stopped suddenly, plunging the church into an even deeper silence. The group froze, their eyes darting around the dimly lit space, searching for any sign of movement. Then, from the far corner of the church, a figure emerged. It was cloaked in black, its face obscured by a hood. The air around it seemed to shimmer unnaturally, like heat waves, rising from asphalt. "Who are you?" Emily stammered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it raised a hand, and the heavy church doors creaked open slightly, letting in a sliver of the inky darkness outside. The hum returned, louder than before, vibrating through their bones. "You have brought them here," the figure said, its voice layered with tones, as if multiple people were speaking at once. "This sacred place cannot hold them for long." Jack stepped forward, his fear momentarily overshadowed by frustration. "What are you talking about? We didn't bring them here, they came after us." "You lit the flame," the figure replied, its tone calm but unwavering. "You awakened what was dormant. Now, they will not rest until the debt is paid." Sarah took a shaky step forward, her knife still in hand. "How do we stop them? There has to be a way to fix this, right?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. "There is a way," it said finally. "But it requires sacrifice." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "What kind of sacrifice?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and otherworldly. "The fire you lit was more than light. It was an invitation. To close the way, you must extinguish it completely. But fire feeds on life." Jack's stomach sank. "What does that mean? We have to what? Offer someone to the flames?" The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured to the altar at the front of the church, where an ancient, weathered bowl sat. Symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly with a dull, eerie light. "That bowl," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is it?" "It is the key," the figure replied. "Fill it with the essence of the living. Only then can the balance be restored." "Essence of the living?" Nate repeated, his voice rising in panic. "That's insane. We're not just going to sacrifice someone. Then you will all perish," the figure said coldly, turning to leave. "Wait," Jack called, his voice filled with desperation. "There has to be another way." The figure paused, its hooded face turning back toward them. "Choose quickly," it said, its voice echoing ominously. "They are coming." The sliver of darkness at the door began to spread, shadows creeping into the church, like tendrils of ink. The hum grew louder, vibrating the very air around them. Jack turned to the others, his mind racing. "We need to figure this out. Fast." Sarah stared at the bowl, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What if? What if it doesn't mean a life? What if it's something else? Like blood, or... "Blood?" Nate interrupted, his face pale. "Are you hearing yourself? You're talking about bleeding ourselves dry." "It's better than dying," Sarah shot back. Emily's voice cut through their argument, trembling but firm. "We don't have time to argue. We have to try something, anything." Jack nodded, grabbing the bowl and placing it on the floor. "All right. If it's blood they need, then we'll give it. Just enough to see if it works." The group hesitated, but one by one, they nodded. Jack used a shard of broken glass to make a small cut on his palm, letting a few drops of blood fall into the bowl. The symbols glowed brighter, pulsing faintly. "It's working," Sarah said, her voice filled with cautious hope. The others followed suit, each adding their blood to the bowl. The glow intensified, and the shadows at the door seemed to hesitate, as if repelled by the light. But the hum didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. "It's not enough," the figure said, reappearing from the shadows. "A greater sacrifice is required." Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. "What kind of sacrifice?" The figure didn't answer. It simply pointed to the flames of a single candle on the altar. Jack's heart sank as understanding dawned on him. "One of us has to go," he whispered. The group fell silent, the weight of the revelation crushing them. "I'll do it," Sarah said suddenly, her voice steady. "No," Jack said firmly. "We'll find another way." "There isn't another way," Sarah insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "If it means saving the rest of you, I'll do it." Jack grabbed Sarah's arm, his voice rising with desperation. "No. We stick together. We can't just let you do this." Sarah turned to him, her face pale, but resolute. "Jack, listen to me. We don't have time to argue. If I don't do this, none of us make it out. Please, just let me do this." The shadows crept closer, slithering across the floor, like living things. The air grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light. Emily sobbed quietly, clutching her arms. "There has to be another way, there has to." The figure stood motionless, its presence heavy and foreboding. "Time is running out," it said, its voice like a distant echo. Jack looked at Sarah, his mind racing for a solution. "What if we all give more? Maybe if we all—" "No," Sarah cut him off, her voice firm. "It won't be enough. You know it won't. This is the only way." She stepped toward the altar, her hands trembling, but steady. The candle's flame flickered, casting eerie shadows on her face. She turned back to the group, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. "Promise me. You'll make it out of here." Jack's voice broke as he replied, "Sarah, don't. Promise me." She shouted, her voice echoing through the church. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I promise." Sarah nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. She reached out, her fingers brushing the flame of the candle. The moment her skin touched the fire, it flared brightly, engulfing her in a radiant light. "Sarah!" Emily screamed, lunging forward, but Jack held her back. The light grew blinding, forcing them to shield their eyes. The hum reached a deafening pitch, shaking the very foundation of the church. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence. When they opened their eyes, Sarah was gone. The candle had burned out, its smoke curling upward, like a ghostly tendril. The shadows were gone, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. The group stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Jack stared at the empty altar, his fists clenched. "She's gone," he whispered. Emily collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Nate stood frozen, his face pale and expressionless. The figure stepped forward, its voice softer now. "The balance has been restored. You are free to leave." Jack turned to it, his eyes blazing with anger. "Why her? Why did it have to be her?" The figure didn't respond. It simply raised a hand, and the heavy church doors creaked open, revealing the night beyond. Without another word, The group stumbled out, into the cold night air. The stars above seemed brighter now, the oppressive darkness replaced by an uneasy calm. They walked in silence, their steps heavy with grief. When they reached the beach, the fire pit was gone, replaced by undisturbed sand. It was as if the events of the night had never happened. But they knew better. Jack turned to the others, his voice hollow. "We need to stick together. For her." Emily nodded, wiping her tears. Nate looked up at the sky, his face filled with regret. "She saved us," he said quietly. As they made their way back to the town, the whispers of the night lingered in their minds. They knew they would never forget what had happened, nor would they ever return to that cursed beach. But sometimes, when Jack is alone, he swears he hears Sarah's voice on the wind, a faint whisper that says, "Keep your promise." And he vows to never forget her sacrifice. Check out the next story. Could it be darker than this one? And you know what to do now: like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss anything.